further ado, allow me to introduce Mr. Fergus Finlay.
This is very intimidating.
We've only just got started. Okay, Fergus, you are Chief Executive of Barnardos. What is Barnardos?
Barnardos is a charity that works for children. We've been in Ireland now for 50 years. It was originally started in Ireland in 1962. In fact, next week, the Irish government has agreed to issue a stamp, commemorative stamp, with a picture of a little girl on it and a tiny little picture of Thomas Barnardo, who founded the charity back in Victorian times. Thomas Barnardo was a young Dubliner, born in Dame Street in Dublin, and educated originally in Dublin. In fact, he was educated in St. Patrick's Grammar School, which is the school attached to the cathedral. The principal there was a man called Dundas, who used to beat the boys unmercifully. It was his way of teaching. He taught with a stick in his hand. And although Thomas Barnardo was never beaten himself, his brother was, and he formed a lifelong abhorrence and detestation of any form of physical violence and cruelty. Thomas Barnardo was a bit of a chancer. He went to England to study medicine because he wanted to be a missionary in the Far East. And he dropped out of medical school after a year or so, but decided that he would call himself Dr. Barnardo anyway. And he was known as Dr. Barnardo all his life. In later years, he got a couple of honorary doctorates. So that sort of made it legitimate, I suppose. The reason he dropped out was because he was in digs in the East End of London, in a very poor part of the city, and became aware, mainly by meeting a young boy who was begging outside his lodgings, of the number of kids, most of them, but not all of them, boys, who were sleeping rough. And in those days, the place where they slept rough most was on the roofs of the buildings. So he was brought up to the roof of his own building, and a bit like, if any of you saw Mary Poppins, remember that scene where they're all on the roof? Hundreds of children sleeping close to the chimneys where they could get some heat at night. And he managed to get together a bit of money. He had made some rich friends, and he persuaded them to part with some money. And he set up a home for destitute boys in a place called Barkingside. And he put a big sign over the door saying, "No destitute boy ever turned away." And that led to another, and then I think the fourth one was for girls. Well before he died, there were something like 100 Barnardo's homes all over the UK. So they set up a small organisation in Ireland in 1962, and the people involved in the setting up of that organisation were slightly different in the sense that they wanted to work with kids, but they did not want to provide residential services. They wanted to work with, they had a different kind of ethos. They believed that the problems that can happen in families are best solved in families. And that's been sort of the ethos of Barnardo's ever since. Ireland being Ireland, of course, as soon as possible, we decided to split from the UK parent. And there were still sort of friendly links for a long time. I became CEO about 7 years ago, and I discovered that we were still getting a grant of 100,000 a year from Barnardos in the UK for no apparent reason other than out of the goodness of their hearts.
That was nice of them.
It was very nice of them, but I felt that it would be very difficult for Barnardos to grow as we all wanted it to grow as an Irish organisation while we were still taking this. So I took a deep breath and I said to Barnardos in the UK, thanks very much, but no thanks. And we severed the last link by turning down that money. And then I think we probably had about, we were probably working with about everything has kind of more or less doubled since then. The organisation has become a reasonably substantial organisation now. There are about 400 of us who work in Barnardos. And we still work to the same ethos. If there are problems in a family, we want to try and help so far as we can, solve them within the family. So at the heart of what we do are two things. We do what we call targeted early intervention, which is basically working with preschool children. We work with preschool children who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and the aim of that work is to give them the skills, the confidence, and the ability to go to school, to enjoy school, to get the most out of school.
Can I just play devil's advocate for a minute? You target children at preschool level, but sure, aren't there a load of preschools around the country, and sure, it's just babysitting and anybody can do that. Why would Barnardos want to get involved in that?
Well, first of all, it's not just babysitting.
How is it not? In what way?
Well, it's not in a variety of different ways. First of all, the staff ratios are totally different that you'll find in any creche. Every child who comes to a Barnardos preschool has a careful, detailed and thoroughgoing assessment, which is done with the family and over a period of days. Every child has a key worker, and that key worker is responsible for the development and growth of that child and for relationships with the child's family. We have a very highly developed curriculum. But it was based on the high scope model that some of you will be familiar with, but we've added additional dimensions to it based on work we've done with American universities and so on. We call it Too Small. So it addresses the developmental needs, the social needs, the emotional needs of children in very specific ways. And we maintain one-to-one relationships with the kids. Now, that's not to say that there's a staff member for every child. I sometimes wish that was possible, but it's not. But everyone who works in a project has a small number of families that they work with and a small number of kids that they work with, and they are the key workers for that child.
Well, these children that you're talking about, I mean, in creches and preschools, I mean, they're not the ones that are going to be holding up cars or robbing shops. I mean, would the money not be better spent working with teenagers?
Well, that's the other half of what we do.
Yeah.
The other half of what we do is what we would call family support, where we work in about 20 different communities around Ireland, including some here in Waterford and in the county, usually out of a house in the housing estate where disadvantage exists. We work with kids and with families who are experiencing either social and emotional difficulties around education, who are in danger of dropout, or who are in difficulty at home. And the work is intended to be and is designed as being preventative. But the truth chain is, at least the truth as I understand it, is that if you are faced with a cohort of kids, a group of kids, let's say 16 years of age kids, who have dropped out of school, who are terrorizing neighborhoods, who are drifting into gangs, who are involved in antisocial behavior, I would be ready to bet a week's wages that if you could examine the life history of all those kids, you would find that in 90% of cases, the problem started before they went to school. I am absolutely convinced that the kid who starts badly in school, who starts behind, stays behind, is at much greater risk of dropping out. And they will drop out with serious literacy problems, with serious numeracy problems, and with some emotional problems. They'll drop out sometimes for lack of an identity, for lack of support within the school system. And that all starts in the preschool years, in my view.
Do you see a continuity? Do you see the children that you're encountering first in preschool remaining with you in some way or other right the way through their childhoods, that you've got that connection? Or is there a cut-off point where you feel, okay, we've done our work here?
Well, we hope not, actually. I mean, I remember talking to one of our project leaders who has actually worked in Barnardos for 25 years. And a mum came into her project with her two small kids. and said, you mightn't remember me, but I was here when I was 3 and 4. And I want my kids to come here. And Breda's instant reaction to that was, if she needs her kids to come here, then I failed. If this mum does not have the skills, now Breda would have worked with her for 2 years, 20 years ago. And she felt if this mum really needs that level of support now, then I failed 20 years ago. As it transpired, her memory of childhood was centred on the very happy experience that she had in Barnardos, and she wanted her kids to have the same happy experience. Those kids are not in Barnardos now, they're in a creche and so on. And Mum pops in now and again if she needs a bit of help and support with boundaries or other kinds of parenting issues and so on, because she was more than capable of being the parent she wanted to be. And that's where the success is, in my view. You have to close files. You have to be able to say, this is either working or it's not working. And if it's not working, you've got to find something for the child or for the mum or dad that does work. But you have to close files. We can't hang on to kids because we love them, though we do you know, and it's always a wrench when at the end of a period of work the file gets to be closed. But the file is closed because the child is ready to move on to the next stage, or else because we haven't found the solution and we need to find other ways of helping the child to find the solution.
What does a Chief Executive Officer do? What's your day-to-day work?
Well, it's funny because I thought when I joined, I went to work for Barnardos because I was asked to. I had done some volunteering with the organisation. I knew very little about it. And I was persuaded by a friend of mine to do some volunteering with the organisation. And I was completely blown away by the quality of the staff, the quality of the commitment, you know, the work that was going on. And I was very taken aback by the fact that it was so below the radar. Like, people didn't know what Barnardos did or what it was or where it was or anything like that. I mean, for example, one of the things I discovered was that we were working out of all these buildings. In Athlone, in Waterford, in Edenderry, in Cork, all over the country we were working out of all these buildings. And none of them had a big neon sign over the door saying Barnardos. And I wanted to use that to kind of promote Barnardos and so on. And the first lesson I got was when the staff said, no circumstances, under no circumstances.
Why?
Because, take Athlone as an example. If a mum is really struggling with being the parent she wants to be, and she's looking for a bit of help, and she discovers that help is at hand if she crosses the threshold of a big charity. She may not cross the threshold, but if she discovers that help and support is available in number 7 down the road, it's much easier to pop in for a cup of tea. So all over the country, our projects will be known as number 23 or number 7, and there'll be a little tiny sign on the door saying Barnardos. What I do, and I said to you earlier, Shane, that you could talk to 399 of the 400 people in Barnardos and find more expertise than you'll get from me. I am the supporter-in-chief of the work. That's what I am. I thought originally when I started in Barnardos that I'd be spending time with the kids, that I'd be going on the bus run, that I'd be, you know, helping out at the play groups or doing some of the reading and all that. And I very quickly discovered that the CEO's in the way when he's doing that kind of thing. I get a kick out of it, but I'm not adding value. So I will go down to our projects in a bit of downtime. If they're having a planning session or they're having a Friday afternoon where they're catching up on paperwork and so on, then that's a good time to talk to the boss. So I never see kids in the projects except once a year. I did sort of force myself on a couple of the projects a few years ago when they needed a substitute for the fellow who comes at Christmas with the big white beard and a red suit.
Right.
And I loved the experience so much that I went out and bought my own suit. And I know I have. I could show it to you. Sometime soon it'll be coming out of the wardrobe and going into the back of the car, and it has everything: the boots, the leggings, the beard, everything. Very taken aback to discover I didn't need padding. I bought some padding, don't need it. And I do get to meet, and I get to learn an awful lot. I get to learn. I mean, you learn a lot about. One thing you learn about being Santa Claus is that there are 3 kinds of kids.
Right.
There's the kids who are in a state of wild excitement until Santa Claus arrives. And then excitement turns to terror, and they just cannot wait to get out of the room. There are kids who know full well that this is a fella in a made-up suit, but he has Cadbury selection boxes. And then there are true believers. There are kids, I met a couple of kids in Cork last Christmas, and I can still remember them. I still think about them. I've never seen kids in whose eyes there was less expectation and less hope. These were kids, I won't go into all the reasons, but these were kids who were carrying huge burdens. One was 4 and one was 5. And for 5 minutes, they knew they were in the presence of Santa Claus. And the eyes changed, the spirits lifted. And I floated out of the place.
Yeah.
But last year, for example, I was doing Santa Claus in Finglas, and the kids decided that they wanted to sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star before I left. They gathered around and they sang. And except one boy who didn't sing. So when I was walking out to my reindeer, which were hidden behind the building, I asked one of the staff members why one little boy had chosen not to sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And she said that they had only discovered that morning he didn't know the words of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. He's the first and only 4-year-old I've ever met who doesn't know the words of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And when I inquired into it, the essential reason was that nobody had ever sung it to him. That was the essential reason. And when you have a little boy to whom nobody has ever sung Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, you can bet your bottom dollar that nobody's ever read him a bedtime story, that nobody's ever introduced him to what a book looks like and feels like and what stories are about, that he's probably never had that kind of 10 minutes on mum's lap at the end of the day. And this isn't a judgmental thing at all, that it's what happened in that little boy's life, and I have no doubt whatsoever that what was happening in his mum's life was equally painful. But that's a little boy that you could absolutely predict would be the 16-year-old you mentioned earlier,
yes,
unless there's intervention now. So what I do is I go around, I try to spread the message of Barnardos. I spend all my time, as much of my time as I can, with the people who work in Barnardos, and I spend as much time and more than I would rather spend raising money for Barnardos. That's what I do. And you get involved in debates and issues and so on. A big part of what we decided to start doing a number of years ago was advocacy. One of the reasons we were very quiet was because we were concentrating on the work we were doing.
Just explain maybe what advocacy is.
Okay. Well, advocacy means different things to different people. To us, it means that we spend all our time and effort trying to have the most positive impact we can on the lives of 5,000 kids. There are 100,000 kids in Ireland who live in consistent poverty. That's the official figure, 100,000 kids. And consistent poverty has a variety of very concrete meanings. If you live in consistent poverty, you don't have enough nutrition. You don't have enough heating in your home. You don't have the right clothes to wear. You're very unlikely to be going to school in the right uniform and with all the books and so on. You tend not to get treats. We work with kids who aren't allowed to go to birthday parties because their mums can't afford to host birthday parties for them. And if you go to a birthday party, then you have to invite everyone back to yours. So they don't. So 100,000 kids who live in that situation. If we were 20 times bigger, maybe we could reach them. But if we were 20 times bigger, we'd be a bureaucracy. We'd be we'd be like the HSE. And God knows I don't want to be like the HSE. If there's anybody
No.
here from the HSE, I'm sorry, but I don't want to be like the HSE. So what we do, we spend a little bit of our resources. We had to work it out because we got media questions about it the other day. We spend about 0.5% of our resources every year advocating. And we advocate to change policy. We try to influence government policy. We campaign about stuff. We get as much help as we can to try and gather data and so on. And we gather data from within the experience of our daily work, and we make cases to government. Now, for other people, advocacy means that you go with the family when they need support. And many of our project workers will do that. If some of our families are facing major housing issues, for example, or if the HSE want to see them for some reason, or the Department of Social Protection, they can be terrifying experiences for families. And a Barnardos project worker will nearly always accompany them if they need to be accompanied and so on. So that's advocacy on the individual scale. The advocacy we do as an organisation is aimed at trying to influence government policy and trying to change government policy. And, you know, I think we've been reasonably successful at it, but only, in my view, to the point where children are on the political agenda. We're not at the stage where we can say we've solved the problems that we wanted to put on the political agenda. But 6 or 7 years ago, children were not on the political agenda.
If you listen to some of the stories that you've been telling about your own experiences as Santa and some of the other cases that you've mentioned, in a way you're kind of highlighting all the reasons why we do the work we do, you know, why we're involved in this and kind of the need that is out there. But Ireland doesn't have a proud history of child and social care. Is that something that you're very aware of as you do the work that you do, that these are things that we can never allow to happen again, all of the terrible scandals that we've had?
Well, I mean, like there's a lot of people in this room who are studying to work in this area and who want to work in this area. And I mean, I come from a background, I've been all my life a member of one political party, the Labour Party. And I come from a background where I always believed that the state can and should do everything, that the state can solve the problems children face and should and so on. I don't believe that anymore. Now, maybe I'm speaking from a vested interest, but I absolutely believe now that the single most important thing we can do for kids is get the mix right, get the balance right. And I suppose the crude way maybe I could put this is that I still believe that if you need to remove a child quickly and urgently to a place of safety, if that child is at risk, then the state is the only body that can really do that. If you need to give a child or to help a child to build his or her own resilience, his or her own capacity to cope with adversity, if you need to help a child to learn how to make friends and how to mix with other kids and resolve problems without fighting or biting or scratching or, you know, all the things that can happen, why on earth would you ask the state to do that? It requires creativity, it requires imagination, it requires patience. It requires occasionally taking risks. And the state is not equipped to do any of those kind of things. What the state is, I think, equipped to do is support it better. And therefore, I now believe that the state, the private sector, and above all, the community, in a reasonably well-organised way, is the way to address the things that we failed to address in the past. I don't think any of us in Ireland, we all had this kind of suspicion that there was something that went on with kids. Many of us were raised believing that children should be seen and not heard. Things that happened in our own lives tended to be kind of brushed under the carpet and so on. But it wasn't until a few individual survivors of institutional abuse, it wasn't until people like you published books and so on. And then, suddenly, the Ryan Report, which suddenly revealed a scale, a horrible, terrible scale. And just before the Ryan Report, and it's the one that I still remember best, the Ryan Report should probably have been called the Lafoy Report, because the first judge who chaired the commission was Judge Lafoy, and she resigned in a row with the then government. But before she resigned, she published a report on Baltimore School in Cork. And I picked up this report, and I couldn't believe what I read.
It's shocking, isn't it?
I love Baltimore. Like my family and I used to holiday in West Cork for something all the years my kids were growing up. We love Baltimore. It's the most beautiful little town. I know it. And I didn't know this school existed. And this school was still alive, still going, long after I was born. Long after I was born. The patron was the Bishop of Cork, and it was funded by the state. And when it was eventually closed down, it had a healthy bank balance. It had money in the bank. And the reason it had money in the bank was because it ran at a profit. The only income it had was the income it got for looking after kids. And the way it made a profit was by starving them, by allowing kids, boys, for example, to bath once a week. And they bathed in a tub. And the water in the tub was changed after every 6 boys. The kids were trained to steal their food in the town of Baltimore, or in the fields of Baltimore. They scavenged in the field for food. And this was when I was a kid. Now, if you read and it's online, you can read Lafoy. If you Google Lafoy Baltimore, you can read it all. She talks at length about the physical abuse, the sexual abuse that went on. But before she gets there, she talks about the daily lives of the kids, the rats, the hunger, the fact that the kids didn't even grow. All of the witnesses who came forward and testified to Lafoy, she noted this herself. They were all what she called small in stature. And these were middle-aged to older people. They had lost 2 inches in height by spending 14 years on a starvation diet, so that an organisation funded by the state and run by the bishop could make a profit. Now, you might read that kind of thing and say to yourself, how could you ever let the state run anything ever again? But the thing I keep saying over and over and over again, at any given time in Baltimore, there were 170 kids. It's, about the same number as people in this room, 170, all starving, all in skinny clothes. There's a heartbreaking incident, and it may not sound like a big thing in the scheme of things. A boy eventually sent home after 16 years. Went there at 2, left there at 18. And he had an address on the North Circular Road in Dublin. That was where he was going. And he walked from Houston Station to this place in all he had when he left Baltimore: a raggedy shirt and short trousers. Short trousers at 18 years of age. And as an elderly man, he could remember the shame as he walked through the streets of people looking at him and pointing at him and so on, because he must have looked ridiculous. Every single one of those 170 kids at any given time was sent to Baltimore by a judge in a court. Not a single one of them ever was represented or heard in that court. We run a service. It's the only adult service we run in Barnardos. I was going to talk about some of the specialist services that we run, but one of them is a service we were asked to set up a number of years ago for survivors of institutional abuse. We call the service Origins, and it's a service that's probably coming to the end of its life now because, if you like, we're running out of people who need it. But this service has dedicated itself to helping survivors who lost all connection with their family to trace their roots, and where it's possible, to effect reunification with siblings and family and so on. And it has worked with people who lost their families 50 and 60 years ago and never saw them again. And some amazing discoveries have been made. But one of the discoveries that was made was that the people who work in the service are really, really good at finding records. And everyone who was sent away has a court record somewhere. And written on the court record, in the judge's handwriting, is the reason they were sent away. And sometimes it's the only scrap of paper that can be found. One of them said, "Mother, an imbecile." Now, Mother almost certainly wasn't an imbecile. Maybe she had postnatal depression, maybe she had a nervous breakdown, maybe she was, depressed in some fashion. And because of that, somebody decided she wasn't safe to look after her child, so she lost her child and never saw her child again. Another said, "Mother, a whore." Almost certainly, Mother wasn't a whore, but she may have had an affair. And for that reason, a judge somewhere decided she should never see her child again. And she never did. That's what we did in Ireland. And the rest of us, if we knew anything about it, by and large, did nothing. But most of us didn't know.
Well, it was colluded with to an extent, even by silence or omission, wasn't it?
There were a number over the years, and some of the records demonstrate this. Dermot Ferreter, the historian, has written very well about this. There were a small number of people who spoke out. Departmental inspectors, doctors, people like that. They were all sat on, all silenced, all threatened, in some cases moved out of their jobs into other jobs and so on. So there was an astonishing level of collusion at official level in all of this. But the point that came home to me out of all this was, if you really want to ensure that it never happens again, you can never put a child in front of a judge without a guarantee that the child will be heard. Never, ever, ever. Last year, not 1950, last year there were 8,000 proceedings in Irish courts that affected the welfare of children in fundamental ways. And I'm not talking about criminal proceedings. These are non-criminal proceedings. They dealt with care, they dealt with custody, they dealt with supervision orders, and they dealt with issues of access relating to marital breakdown. All told, there were 8,000. Now, we don't know how many children were involved in these. There'd be some double counting and some repetition, but there'd also be multiple children involved in some of the cases. About 2,000 of them were represented, in the main by guardians ad litem, and in some cases by guardians ad litem who had solicitors working with them.
Could you just explain what a guardian ad
litem is? A guardian ad litem is an officer appointed by the court to prepare a report for the court on the best interests of the child. And a guardian ad litem is appointed on the absolute discretion of the judge in the case. If the judge wants a report that's independent of the HSE, that's independent of the family, that's solely focused on the welfare and best interest and needs and wishes of the child, they'll ask a guardian ad litem to go and do it. And guardians ad litem are not lawyers. They have a range of different qualifications, but most of them would be qualified in working with children in a variety of different ways, social care, social work, and so on. And they would have a lot of experience of talking to children, of understanding children, and so on. So about 2,000 cases would have had the benefit of that kind of advice. 6,000 didn't, and that's last year. So we're still operating in an environment where a judge has total discretion. Now, I'm not saying this out of hostility to judges. I'm absolutely certain that every judge believes that he or she is doing the best they can in whatever difficult circumstances they face. But if you want to ensure that we can never again have a Baltimore school, you have to ensure that judges are only allowed to make these decisions in the best interest of children, and only after they take account of the views of children.
The children's rights referendum has been in the media an awful lot over the past few weeks. I mean, we were discussing earlier that it's been knocking around for years, in fact, but it's really come to the fore because I suppose we're getting very near to the point where we're going to have to go to the ballot about it. What role has Barnardos had in, I suppose, the campaign to move this forward? Because I know you've been involved in a variety of referenda campaigns over the years.
Well, I suppose we've had two roles. We had a sort of, if you like, behind-the-scenes role in trying to campaign for the holding of a referendum, in trying to encourage the development of a set of words, in working with politicians on all sides of Leinster House to try and argue the case for a set of words.
Why do we need a referendum?
Well, we need a referendum because we're not as good as we should be. We need a referendum because we need to change culture. I'm not going to say to anybody, that the morning after we vote yes, if we do, and I hope we do, the morning after we vote yes, we're not going to wake up and suddenly discover that every child in Ireland is happy and healthy and well-fed and safe and comfortable and growing. That's not going to happen the morning after. We are going to wake up and say and discover that we have sent the strongest possible message that a people can send to its politicians and policymakers and judges and lawmakers, that that's what we want to get towards. That's where we want to move. Culture follows the Constitution in many ways. This Constitution will not have a specific impact, this constitutional change, on huge numbers of children immediately. I passionately believe that it will force the culture to change in a whole variety of ways. It'll force better practice, it'll force higher standards, it'll force more resources as time goes by. Not overnight, but as time goes by. And it will have an immediate impact on a relatively small but highly vulnerable number of children. The adoption change, for example, will impact a small number of children who are in a complete legal limbo at the moment. And the insistence that every child should be heard and that decisions should be made in the best interest of children as a paramount concern will have an immediate impact on a small number of children who are vulnerable right now. But the assertion by us that all our children are equal and that all our children are entitled to a childhood that's based on knowing who they are, feeling safe, all of that, is a very, very powerful statement to send to policymakers and lawmakers. And that's why I think we need a referendum.
In terms of social change, there's been an awful lot of social change in Ireland over the last couple of decades, and you have been to the fore in terms of some of that. I'm thinking particularly about the election of Mary Robinson as president. I know you were very involved in that campaign. Having the first woman be president in Ireland must have been a major point in your career. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, it was. I mean, it's almost impossible in a way to describe how that felt and what it meant. I mean, I knew a long time out that Mary Robinson was going to win. I knew absolutely with 100% conviction that Mary Robinson was going to win, because we travelled around the country and you kept meeting people, turning up to her meetings that you weren't expecting to meet. How do I say this in a way that doesn't offend anybody? Please don't think I'm not in
You're
any
a fairly
sense
tough
to be
bunch. It's very hard to offend them. So.
But you kept meeting your own mother. You know, you'd go into Sligo or Mayo, and you kept meeting your own mother in a winter coat on our way from Mass, from Saturday evening Mass, perhaps, on our way to see Mary Robinson speak. And these were not the people that you were expecting to meet. Kept meeting farmers. I remember stopping in Lyra Crampon in the bus. Anybody know where Lyra Crampon is?
Never heard of it.
There you are. It's in what is politely known, even in Kerry, as the arse end of nowhere. It's in Kerry, and it's a crossroads. I've never been there before or since, but Dick Spring was on the bus and he insisted we had to go to Lyra Crampon. There were 100 people waiting at the crossroads for the bus to stop. Most of them were people who'd rather be dead than ever vote for Dick Spring, and nobody was more surprised to see them than he was. So you knew that something was changing in Ireland. And I stopped in a town square in Portlaoise one night, and I talked to a group of these women who were all like my mother on their way from Mass. And they all told me that they'd voted against divorce in the mid-80s, that they had voted for the pro-life amendment in 1983. And they all felt that a bit of light needed to be let in, that a bit of something different needed to happen. And they saw Mary Robinson as the key to that. So it was actually in people's heads. The election of Mary Robinson was a huge turning point. And it made a lot of other things possible in Ireland, psychologically and spiritually and in all sorts of other ways. It was the moment when, in social terms, people said, some of the things we did weren't all that kind and weren't all that fair, and here's something that we could do that's different. I mean, 3 or 4 years after Mary Robinson's election, we had another divorce referendum, and it was carried. And I don't believe to this day it would have been carried if Mary Robinson hadn't been elected. Now, the sadness for me is that some of that sense of light has gone, has faded. I think we've all retreated a bit now into fear and anxiety and doubt and so on because of our economic circumstances. But it was a massive turning point and a huge thing to be involved in, an absolutely enormous
I think it's possibly also because she was a woman who was a politician but appeared to stand for honesty and integrity, and almost every other politician that's trudged along after her seems to stand for the complete opposite. So it seems like that's been a turnabout.
We had a hard time persuading her to run. And the reason was because she said to us, if I run, you'll expect me to compromise. And we said to her, no, we won't. We want you to run because of who you are and because of what you stand for. And she said, I don't believe you. You will insist that I compromise, that I shut up about some things, that I not express my views about other things. And I'm not going to run because I don't want that to happen. And it took us 3 weeks to persuade her that we didn't want her to compromise, that we wanted her to be who she was. The only compromise, and I was the one who was deputed to say this, and it wasn't easy, the only compromise that we wanted her to make was about her hair. And she eventually consented to go to a hairdresser and couldn't believe what she saw in the mirror. And to be fair, she's never changed her hair back to what it was. She had long, straight, academic hair, and it just didn't suit her. It made her look stiff and distant and reserved. And it wasn't my idea. I wouldn't have a clue. I mean, like, look at me. I mean, am I going to give people advice about their hair? It wasn't my idea, but I was the one who had to say it. And she probably looked at me and said, he's giving me advice about hair. But no other compromise was she ever asked to make. And that was the best thing about that election, was that you elected somebody because of their values, not because they hid their values.
Okay, I've got one more question
Not
for
like
you
Mitt Romney.
before we hand over to questions from the audience, so start preparing yourselves. It's something that's been put to me on a number of occasions as well. Every time I pop up in some media or other, I'm talking about something miserable. And I dare say, you know, you have the same experience as well. Every time you're asked to come on a show or talk about something, you're talking about dark and doom and gloom and awful things that have happened to people. And you're working on a daily basis with very, very tough issues and hard experiences that people have had. How do you cope with that? How do you not bring that stuff home with you, or do you bring it home with you?
Well, my missus, if she was here, would tell you that I am an extremely well-balanced person, but only because I have a chip on both shoulders, and I bring them both home all the time. I love my work. I adore my work. I love the kids I meet. I love the experiences I have. I especially love, and I mean, when I say this, people think it's a kind of a cliche, but I love the gang of people I work with. I mean, I've worked for, I've worked for 45 years. I've just realised that, Shane. I wasn't depressed until this minute. And I've never worked with a better bunch of people. I've never worked with a better bunch of people. And I mean, like sometimes, you know, sometimes you're really fired up with enthusiasm by the mission or by the cause or, you know, by, you know, the results or by, you know, solving a problem or whatever. But what keeps you, everyone, and I think this is true of everybody, what keeps everybody going day after day after day is working with great people. One of the rules we have in Barnardos is if you have a mind, you better speak it. And if you don't speak it, we all come to the conclusion you don't have a mind. Now, sometimes I live to regret that. Yesterday, we have a brilliant woman who works in Barnardos, and she has, over the years, she's learned a huge amount about social media. So she's taken responsibility for a whole lot of this kind of social media activity we do. And we use social media for campaigning, for fundraising, for getting the message out, and so on. Yesterday, I went up to her and said, listen, that thing that you developed for the website, I want to give that to somebody else as part of the Yes for Children campaign. And she said, no, I developed that for Barnardos, not for anybody else. Go away. And I said, but I promised them that they could have it. And she said, well, you shouldn't have, not without consulting me. And I had to kind of crawl out of the room and come back in and say, well, is there anything, or whatever. She's a wet day in the place. I'm the CEO. And she's telling me to go away and mind my own business. And I love that. I think it is fantastic. Now, I was really pissed off at the time, I have to tell you. But like, she was right, and she was right to stand her ground, and so on. So I hope everybody gets to work in organisations where people can actually stand up and tell each other what they think and so on, because it just makes work fun, you know. I get angry. I've never been depressed in my life. I get really angry sometimes at the experiences that I see. And about the problems that aren't immediately solvable. But Barnardos, I think, is an organisation that has become really, really good at channeling anger into results and outcomes, and at focusing its anger on actually changing lives for the better. And nothing is more exciting than that.
Would you consider yourself to be a crusader?
No. Not at all. I get involved in stuff. I'm the most reluctant volunteer in Ireland, I would think. I've been a volunteer and a kind of a campaigner around issues of disability for 30 years. But not because I want to. That's because a long time ago, I had a daughter who was born with Down syndrome, and the night I was told she had Down syndrome, I was told, take her home, she'll never amount to anything, but she'll never cause you too much trouble. That's what I was told the night she was born. I didn't know what Down syndrome was. This was 1972. And it wasn't until the nurse said, have you ever heard the term mongoloid? Now, that's what kids with Down syndrome were called then, mongoloid kids, that I knew what it was. And my missus and I were put in a situation where we had no choice. And it is as true today as it was then, that when a child with a disability comes into your life, you cross a threshold into second-class citizenship. You start encountering bureaucracy in a way that you never had before. Until our daughter was 16, my wife, this is a very long answer to the question.
It's okay.
My wife used to get a thing called the domiciliary care allowance because she gave up full-time work. She gave up work to become a full-time developer, grower of Mandy. And she got this domiciliary care allowance, which I think was 30 euros a month at the time. And it was subject to a condition, and the condition was that once a year a doctor employed by the then health authority, full-time public servant doctor, came to the house to make sure that Mandy's Down syndrome hadn't been cured yet. Oh my God. That condition didn't wasn't done away with until maybe 10 years ago, after 30 years of campaigning. We used to teach parents to say to these doctors, the day my daughter's Down syndrome is cured, you won't be seeing me anymore because I'll be in the Bahamas spending the millions that I have earned from selling that cure to the rest of the world. But those kind of mad, stupid, crazy, bureaucratic things are part of the life of everyone with a disability: physical, sensory, mobility, intellectual. If you have a disability, the system makes you a second-class citizen, and you fight battle after battle after battle. It shouldn't have been possible in a civilized country for people with profound physical disabilities to have to spend the night outside government buildings in their wheelchairs in freezing weather. And the only thing the system discovered about those people, even though they kept calling them vulnerable, was that they were anything but vulnerable. They were simply the most determined group of people that they'd ever met. Now, am I a crusader? No, I'm not a crusader. But these kind of things really piss me off. And I think they should piss everyone off. And I think if we all spent a bit of time being really pissed off, pardon the expression, on behalf of other people, there'd be an awful lot less to be pissed off about.
Hear, hear.
Okay, you cannot hide from me. I know you're out there. Jesse, I think you got a question? So we need a roving mic up here to Jesse, please. Where's our roving microphone people? Somebody help Lauren there with the... You got it?
Hey,
Just introduce yourself first, Jesse.
hey, I'm Jesse. I'm doing a special needs course. How far do you think we've come related to the physical disabilities? How far do you think we've come so far towards people with physical disabilities, and how far should we have yet to come?
In terms of access and things
Yeah.
like that, Fergus.
Like
Thanks,
disabled
Jesse.
titles, etc.
Well, we paid brilliant lip service to it. We passed a law, trying to remember when, 2005, 2006 maybe, called the Disability Act. And it was described at the time as the most far-reaching piece of legislation in Europe, if not the world, in relation to the rights of people with disabilities. And it was the second or third attempt to pass the law because people with disabilities had vigorously campaigned against the first couple. And then I think we all ran a bit out of steam. It was impossible to keep the campaigns going. So the Parliament of Ireland passed a law on the rights of people with disabilities. And you can read it still. It's 55 pages long. And the word rights doesn't appear once in it from start to finish. Nothing. And in effect, what that law provided was a right to be assessed and to get a statement of your needs arising from that assessment. But if the needs ran for a page and a half, you need speech therapy, you need physical supports, you need adaptable housing, whatever the needs were, there's a little clause in the Act which says, get them when we can afford them. So you were entitled basically to a statement of the needs that would never be met. The one thing that Act did do was it imposed certain obligations on public bodies to make their buildings more accessible. I don't know how accessible this building is. It didn't feel accessible as we were coming in. Beautiful building and all as it is. And that obligation is there. But there are no enforceable standards. There's no independent inspection. There are no absolute legal rights to anything. That's why it was so possible for the HSE to decide, geez, we need to find a 10 million saving, let's cut this. And it was somebody else's problem to manage. So I think we have a fierce long way to go before people with disabilities, whatever the disabilities are, can claim to be first-class citizens of the republic that they're supposed to be first-class citizens of. I don't think it's as bad as it was. But I think there are still enormous bureaucratic challenges, and I think there are still issues of political will. And I don't think we've cracked all that. I also think, and this always gets me into trouble when I say it, that there's huge waste in the area, enormous waste in the area. I have a daughter with an intellectual disability who's living, quote unquote, independently. And she's living in one of the best possible places that you can in Dublin. We were trying to work it out this morning, actually. We were discussing it. The state pays something like 125,000 a year to the service provider to enable her to live in an apartment with 2 other women in a cluster of apartments which has some staff, not a lot, but some staff, and to provide her with therapeutic, advantageous, educational day services. The day services are so bad that she and all her friends have opted out of them entirely, and they've gone elsewhere for the day services, and they're buying them themselves. The place she lives in, she's charged a rent for, she contributes to the cost of her food, and so on. She has an income of €200 a week, and the service provider, which gets €125,000 from the state, takes €90 of that towards her rent, her ESB, and so on. So she's €110 left, with which she provides her day services, her clothes, her holidays. She doesn't smoke, thank God, but her pint of Guinness. And so on. Now, I have no problem with Mandy paying something towards her rent, paying for her own clothes, and all of that. If I thought that the €135,000 or €25,000 that the state gives was going where it would provide a decent service for somebody, you know, as long as Mandy can afford to make a contribution, she should. The day will come when she might need more intensive care. Now, I'm only using Mandy as an example. There are thousands and thousands of people in these services. We spend something like $2.5 million a year on providing services. We spend so much that everybody with a disability should have a Rolls-Royce service. Because there aren't that many people. You know, there aren't, we spend something like, as taxpayers, we spend something like $70,000 a year to provide services for every person with a disability in Ireland. And still the services are entirely substandard. I've come to the view, and I think it is and will become public policy, that sooner or later the state is going to have to decide we're going to give that $70,000 to the people with disabilities themselves, not in cash. But actually, I did work it out. I wrote a piece about this recently. It costs $70,000 a year for every person with a disability. It costs the taxpayer $70,000 a year. It costs, because I looked it up on the web, it costs $70,000 a year to live in the Shelbourne Hotel, right? So you could accommodate everyone with a disability in the Shelbourne Hotel on a full-time basis, if they don't fit, and it wouldn't cost you any more. That's daft, crazy. The solution, in my view, is individual, what I call individualized funding, where service providers have to go to the people with disabilities and say, you have the money, we'd love to provide you with a service that's tailored to your needs. Is that okay? That wouldn't necessarily solve all the problems, but it's the kind of step we need to take.
Thank you very much. Great. Thanks, Jesse.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Okay, just introduce yourself and ask us your question.
Hi, my name is Isabel Murphy. I'm a Community Development Level 6 student at the moment, so I think I can do everything. But my question is, now I had no intention of asking questions today, but it was just something you said yourself. Now, you were going on about Christmas parties and stuff, but I want to know, do you think all Barnardos centres are run equally and with the same determination. Because I myself went to Barnardos 13 years ago. T-shirt, ripped pants, and all that happened to me was I was brought through the house into the back garden. Now I made the coolest lollipop stick fish ever, but I mean, no one ever asked me my name, where I came from, or anything. And a few years later
where was this? If you don't say, if you don't want to say, but...
Oh no, I just wasn't sure if I was allowed to say it. I was out in Ballybeg. Everyone's heard of Ballybeg, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
And, but I just want to know really, because my sister went there a few years later, and every Saturday and Sunday she came home with a bag of junk food, and that was it, like. So I just wasn't sure. It's just the way you were going on about the Christmas parties and stuff, and it sounded like a good idea. We never really experienced it.
Okay, thanks very much. Fergus.
Well, I mean, I'm really sorry that was your experience. I hope that that would not be the experience of anyone who goes to any of our projects today. I think there is very little doubt that in our organisation, as well as in every other organisation, standards needed to be improved. And I think the thing that needed to be improved most was respect. Respect for the parents, respect for the kids. We have worked really, really hard on that. And I hope it would be the case that anyone who would work with a Barnardos project today, they mightn't feel all their problems had been addressed, but I hope they would feel that they had been respected, and that they had been respected in a way that made a difference to them. If that wasn't always the case, then I'm really sorry it wasn't always the case. And I'd have to admit, though, I would have to admit one thing. Junk food might still be a possibility. Now, I'm not being facetious in any way, but a number of years ago, we introduced breakfast clubs and lunch clubs and all that kind of thing. And we took it really, really seriously, the whole business of, appropriate diet and proper nutrition and all that kind of thing. And we discovered that kids wouldn't come to the breakfast clubs unless there was sausages and rashers. And I'm afraid you will still see sausages and rashers in Barnardos projects as a consequence of that. But that's not intended in any way to be, a substitute for anything. I hope, I hope it is the case that no child who comes to a Barnardos project today, or for as long as I'm responsible, feels disrespected by the project. We can't guarantee to address all the needs that we encounter or to solve all the problems, though we try as hard as we can. But if we've ever disrespected a child, we would need to be thoroughly ashamed of ourselves.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Got one roving mic down the back there. Owen.
First, I'd like to thank you for coming to Waterford. It's great to hear you live in Waterford, and congratulate you as well for the great work that Barnardos are doing, especially that problem solving within the family, which I think is great. Now, my one is in relation to the new referendum. I know you're very much a supporter of it. Now, the concerns I'd have is that, and feel ashamed in one sense about the institutional violence that we've seen. Like just out the road there was the Good Shepherd Convent, where young people were abused. We'd know of people in industrial schools that were abused. And just from your own words there earlier, you were saying it was the judicial system that sent these people to these institutions. So I'd like to know is that why should we have any faith in the further judicial systems or decisions? Surely they'll just make the same thing, and may it take an emphasis away from solving the thing within the family. And just even from your figures yourself, you said that over 100,000 were in, as you said, consistent poverty. So could it not be argued within the new amendment that their welfare is compromised at the least? And maybe it would be better if they were put up for adoption, be it forcibly put up for adoption. Is that not a possibility? So again, the one I'd say is that why should we now trust our judicial system? Why not have a better focus on solving problems within the family? And just the last one then is that if the referendum is passed and say children are forcibly adopted, will the natural parents, the mother and father, have any rights of access? Just those questions, please. Thank you.
I'll come to the specific question about access in a moment. Why should we trust? Well, I mean, sometimes people say to me that I'm just against judges. I'm not against judges at all. We trust our judges to protect people's right to liberty, because there is a right to liberty in the Constitution. We trust our judges to protect people's right to own private property, and they have a very good track record in that, because there's a right to private property in the Constitution. We even trust our judges to protect people's right to join a union, to engage in free speech, and they have a very good track record in all those things, because there is a right to those things in the Constitution. The way to ensure that children are safe, or at least safer, is to put into the Constitution a right to be safe. And that right to be safe is implicit, not explicit, implicit in the first element. We've got to put an obligation on everyone in the system who makes a decision about the welfare and future of children to consciously do it in the best interest of children. Now, there have been cases in the past, and you can't actually say that if they were settled only on the basis of the best interest of the children, the outcome would be different. You can't guarantee that, but the perspective has to be different. And to me, and this is only a personal view, to me, the key requirement is to put an obligation on everybody involved to listen to and give a right to every young person whose future is being decided to be heard. And again, if a judge sits and talks to a child about the future they want, if mum and dad are breaking up, if there's trouble in the home, if there's an issue of care or supervision, and the judge talks to the child, not every child will be able to do it as articulately as every other. Some children will say what they think the judge wants to hear, so you've got to change the settings. You've got to make sure that the voice is heard in the way it's meant to be heard. You can't guarantee, and you shouldn't guarantee, that a judge will be led and said by what a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old tells the judge they want. But they've got to listen, and they've got to be influenced by it. And that's, to me, the key requirement that's there. You can't change the Constitution and, as a consequence of that, guarantee that all forms of violence will end and that children will never be terrified again. But if you know that your Constitution is an inhibitor to the best protection of children, you've got to address that, and it is. You asked the question about the question of adoption and access. And if I understood the question, it was, if a child is adopted, will the birth parents continue to have access to the child? The proposition that's in front of the people relates only to the children of married parents, because there is no constitutional barrier to the adoption of the children of single parents at the moment. The reason there is a constitutional barrier to the adoption of married parents is because married parents are defined in our Constitution as the family. You're not a constitutional family unless you are married. Now, I mean, I work with thousands and thousands of families that consist of a mum and a child or 2 children, and they're loving, stable, growing, developmental families. But they're not a family in the eyes of the Constitution. A family in the eyes of the Constitution, which is a married couple, has what they call inalienable rights. Inalienable means they can't be taken away from you, and you can't give them away. So if you are the married parents of a child, you cannot give that child up for adoption. You can abandon the child. You can put the child on a rock in the ocean surrounded by sharks. You can do almost anything you want to the child, but you can't put the child up for adoption. So this provision relates to children who have been abandoned. And the accompanying legislation says that a child, so it will enable children who have been abandoned, and we reckon, nobody knows for sure, we reckon that there may be 2,000 of them in Ireland. It will enable children who've been abandoned by married parents to be adopted. And there are two qualifications. They have to have been abandoned for a period of at least 3 years, and they have to be in a stable fostering arrangement for a period of at least 18 months before they can be considered for adoption. And then they can be adopted. And then, after they've been adopted, and their parents cannot say no to that if this arrangement is passed. The parents who have abandoned them cannot say no to that. But if, for whatever reason, the parents come back into their lives, there is no barrier to access. There's no barrier to the development of a good relationship and so on. And we all know adopted kids who develop relationships with their natural parents, usually their birth mum, as they grow up. We all know that, and there's no barrier to that kind of arrangement in this provision.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi, down the back there. So we need a microphone over here, please.
Hi, my name is Kai Hayes. I'm
Is that mic switched on?
Is it?
Great.
It's on, yeah.
Off you go.
Sorry, maybe I'm not talking loud enough. My name is Kai Hayes, school-age childcare. It's just on regarding the aspects of the new referendum that's coming up. Is there any aspects of it that you do not agree with? Or are there any things where they could actually go further than they actually are?
Okay, so the new children's rights referendum that's coming up, are there any elements of it that you strongly don't agree with or that you think don't go far enough?
I mean, if I'm absolutely honest, I don't think any of it goes far enough. I think it is a step in the right direction. There's none of it that I don't disagree with. But, for example, it was originally hoped that there would be a requirement that the voice of the child, the views of the child, would have to be taken into consideration in every decision that affected a child's future. And that would have included a wide range of administrative decisions. Expulsion from school would be one example of that you couldn't expel a child from school without taking account of the best interests of the child and without listening to the child. And an awful lot of people, particularly in the education system, thought that that would bring the education system to its knees. I happen to disagree with that. I don't think it should ever be easy to expel a child from school. I think it is sometimes necessary. I don't think it should ever be easy. And I don't think it should ever happen without the child getting an opportunity to be heard on the subject. But in the end, it was decided that they couldn't proceed with the range of administrative possibilities. And I think that's a pity. I think that we kind of funked something there. But I do believe, and I said it earlier, that I do believe that cultural change follows the Constitution. And I am absolutely convinced that when the best interest provision is written into the Constitution, it will over time begin to affect all decisions that are made. I mean, it is the case today that decisions are made about care. Decisions are made by the HSE and so on. And I understand why. I know the pressures that are there. I know the pressures that exist within the HSE. But sometimes these decisions that are made about the future welfare of a child are made having regard first and foremost to the resources available within the HSE, and secondarily to the needs and best interests of the child. And I wish that weren't so. But having said that, I'm going to campaign for a yes vote until November the 10th, in the absolute knowledge that some battles are going to have to go on after November the 10th.
Great, thank you, Kai. We're going to take one more question from this gentleman up here. He's been trying to get in from the start. So you need a microphone right the way up the front. Thank you. Again, just introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Martin Malone. I'm studying journalism and photography in the college. Earlier on, you spoke about poverty figures in Ireland, 100,000 children below the poverty line. Number of years ago now, the previous government scrapped combat poverty. Do you think it's time for combat poverty to be re-established on the same footing that it would have been established at its outset?
Well, not just that, actually. I'd re-established a lot of stuff, but they said combat poverty wasn't being scrapped, that it was being absorbed into the department where it would continue to function as a powerful advocate on the issue of poverty. And that's what they did, and it was never heard of again. Now, there is still a unit within the Department of Social Welfare. It has no independence, no voice. Its existence is essentially meaningless. And of course, it should never have been scrapped in the first place, and it should be. One of the things it did that was really useful was it funded occasional bits of research. And it enabled us, the rest of us, to establish some of the links that are there. And not just about poverty, but also about, for example, the link between, well, as we did a study that they helped us to fund some years ago, which established, in a very, very shocking and profound way, the link between maternal well-being, particularly in relation to mental health, and the growth, development, and future of children. And we were able to establish, and it kind of leapt off the page at you, that if you can keep hope alive in families, and particularly in mothers, for their children, then the future of their children is much brighter than if all hope disappears. Now, that's something that has forced us to change the way we go about our business, and we couldn't have done it without combat poverty. But twice a year, they used to put poverty on the front pages of the newspaper, and it ain't there now. So yes is the answer.
One final question. One final question. You were talking about Santi earlier on.
Did I
Do you believe in
You were
him?
talking about Santi earlier on.
Do you believe in him yourself?
Of course I do.
It's very real.
Okay, on that note, yeah. All right, one more very quick one, Trina, okay? Go on over to Trina there, lads. Just before the bus hemorrhage overwhelms us all. Very quickly, Trina.
Trina Welsh, Social Studies. Just on the matter of interests, if the referendum, we all vote yes, which I do hope we do. But what is the case if you know a child is being neglected, or kind of they're not getting looked after? And the best interest, they're like neglected and they're not being looked after. And the best interest of the child is to go into care. But you're saying now that the child has a voice. A lot of the time, I think the majority of the child says, no, I want to stay with my mum. What would happen there?
If a child is being taken into care and the child says they want to stay with their parents, even if it's in the best interest to go into care, what happens?
It just means that the decision has to be made with more care. And it means that sometimes the decision will be, let's give this another chance. I mean, there are kids who are not in care in Ireland now who should be. And there are kids who are in care in Ireland who shouldn't be, who wouldn't be if mum or dad or the family had got a bit more support. Children should never be taken away from their families unless they are at risk or unless they represent a risk. And they should be taken away on the basis of a plan, and the plan should include as a fundamental relationships with the family, reunification with the family, and all of that. That should be the aim and the objective. It's what every child wants. No child that hasn't been abused and that isn't living in terror is going to say to any judge, "Get me out of here." There are some children, though, in Ireland, right this minute, who would say, "Get me out of here," and who will never get the chance to say it. So it's getting that balance right that is the key. Now, one of the reasons we haven't got that balance right is because we set up a structure and we gave it statutory responsibility for the care and welfare of children. And we called that structure the HSE. And it employed 130,000 people. It ran 55 hospitals. It was completely beset. Great people, 99% of them, great people, committed people. It was completely beset from the day it was started with accident and emergency crises, overcrowding crises, cancer crises, crises in every aspect of its operations, overspent in relation to medical cards, overspent in relation to drugs, and statutory responsibility for children, for the welfare of children. 5 years the HSE was in existence, and the word children had never once been mentioned in that first 5 years on the agenda of the board of the HSE. There were members of the board of the HSE who didn't know they had statutory responsibility for children. And all of that changed when a newspaper story broke that said 200 children had died while they were effectively in the care of the HSE. And the HSE's immediate response to that was to say, "What rubbish? Absolute rubbish. Nothing like that." And a statement was put out saying that the number was closer to 23. And then they began to count them, the number who had died, and their systems were so defective that it took them 3 months to figure out that the number was right, that it was 200. And for some policymakers, a lot of people in the sector, that was the last straw. So all of that is now being taken away from the HSE. It will not be responsible anymore. On the 1st of January next year, a new child and family support agency will be set up. It will become the employer of choice, ultimately, I hope, for everyone with a qualification in social care and childcare. And it will have one dedicated mission, which is to be responsible for the care and welfare of vulnerable children in Ireland. And it will be accountable to a minister who will be accountable to the Dáil. And that will be the first moment in the history of Ireland where the system was dedicated to one thing and was accountable in public. It's never happened before. If that doesn't lead to better practice, better decision making, better standards, more focus, less risk, more accountability, and much more commitment to prevention, to early intervention, to getting problems solved early, and so on, it is the only thing that can make that kind of difference. And the strongest possible message that that new system can get is that the people of Ireland have decided in a referendum that that's the way it needs to be. So I think when that sort of jigsaw happens, you will begin to get, not overnight, nothing happens overnight, but you will begin to get better balances in the decisions that affect the lives of children and families. But we're all human, and we're all going to make mistakes.
Okay, thanks, Trini. Okay, very quickly, and then I'm going to let you go. Fergus, what day of the week can we read your column in the Examiner?
Tuesdays, every Tuesday.
Are you plugging any books at the moment?
Examiner.ie. Not at the moment.
Not at the moment, okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.